There's been a power struggle on the streets of Luhansk, which has once again changed the political landscape in the breakaway region of eastern Ukraine. Heavily armed men in camouflage gear blocked entry to government buildings in a pocket of the city. While this was happening, everyday life went on as usual. But within a matter of hours, there was a change in leadership. Igor Plotnitsky, who was the head of the rebel-held region, was replaced by Leonid Pasechnik.
We've always been loyal to the people's will, and now we will follow the path which we have followed during all these years. This is, first of all, a path towards a union with the Russian Federation, being loyal to Minsk agreements, as well as economical and political development of the Republic.
In 2014, Russian-backed separatists in Luhansk and Donetsk declared independence from Ukraine. But as part of the Minsk II peace agreement signed by Russia, Ukraine, France and Germany, the full sovereignty of Ukraine needs to be reinstated, which means that rebel-held areas need to rejoin with the West. They can't pursue a union with Russia. But some separatists in the east accuse Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko and his government of corruption and are in no rush to pursue reconciliation. US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin talked about Ukraine on a recent call. They both say they want to achieve a lasting peace. But will that goal require the use of American military technology, or will that just escalate tensions? The US National Security Council is considering recommending the president signs off on giving $47 million to the Ukrainian government so it can buy American weapons, including anti-tank missiles. There is technically a full ceasefire between Ukrainian government forces and Russian-backed rebels. But in just 2 nights in November, monitors recorded multiple ceasefire violations, including about 400 explosions. So far, this war has claimed more than 10,000 lives, and that toll only continues to grow each week. Natalie Pohanen, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now by Andrei Shevchenko in Toronto. He's a former member of the Ukrainian parliament and is now Ukraine's ambassador to Canada. In Kiev, we have Peter Zalmayev. He's the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, an organization that promotes democracy and human rights in post-communist societies. And in London, Igor Sutyagin, he's a senior research fellow in Russia studies at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Peter Zalmayev, let me begin with you. Tell me what happened with this Game of Thrones in Luhansk, and if it's going to have any major impact on eastern Ukraine.
Well, it is indeed a sort of a Game of Thrones that we've been witnessing there. And if anything, it shows that the effective leadership of these so-called people's republics in Donetsk and Luhansk have no effective control over their own territories. Basically, what happened is that the former leader, the now deposed leader of the Luhansk People's Republic, Igor Plotnitsky, was overthrown in what appears to be a coup by one of his security agency chiefs. Apparently, there was it was as a result of a turf war between these various agencies. This conflict went back to about 2 years ago. But what is important to understand in all of this is that Mr. Plotnitsky was deposed in an illegal coup, and we have not seen any reaction from either Moscow, which is the de facto sponsor of this regime, or from people on the street. Essentially, their very rationale that they, 3 years ago, they opposed the so-called Kiev junta is essentially null and void, because what you're seeing now is that this is an illegal coup, an illegal overthrow. If it had been done in an illegal manner, the power should have been transferred to the the head of the National Assembly. But as it is, we have this Mr. Leonid Pasechnik, who is an appointee by Moscow. He's an FSB, a security service operative, and it seems like he will will now be directly controlled by Moscow. Moscow is basically torn between two different objectives. One is to centralize power and have more control over these two statelets, and the other one is to still keep a semblance of the Minsk process in order, and
Understood.
that has now been thrown into question.
Yeah, and we're going to broaden this out now. Igor, first of all, first things first, is the Kremlin at odds with the FSB here? Do they support different men, or is that just a rumor?
Well, they do not support different. They do not have different agenda. The agenda is, after all, dictated by Moscow. The difficulty for Moscow is that, well, somehow it happened that they are not in the absolute control of what's going on the ground, and that is bad news for them. So, well, this new head of the so-called Luhansk Republic will be controlled more or less effectively from Moscow in general, but in details he would have, well, some freedom of actions, and this fact is very unpleasant news.
Ambassador Shevchenko, Plotnitsky was one of the signatories to the truce in 2015. It's held in a, I guess, there's been a low-intensity conflict over the past couple of years. It hasn't been great, but it hasn't been massive. Is this all going to unravel now because one of the key signatories is no longer around?
I don't see that changed. We have never had actual ceasefire on the ground. The terrorists have never tried to follow the Minsk agreement, and Moscow has never tried actually to fulfill the Minsk agreements. So in that sense, nothing is going to change on the ground. I think if you can picture a jar with fighting spiders, that will pretty much give you the understanding of what's happening in Luhansk, in Donetsk. There is one thing which I would like to reflect on. I wouldn't agree with Igor that this kind of shows that Moscow is losing control over this territory. Yes, it's a tribal land. There are no rules, no laws in this land, which is occupied by the Russians. But on the other hand, we strongly believe that everything which is happening there is under control of Moscow.
Would you agree, Ambassador Shevchenko, that Moscow is showing signs of wanting to extricate itself from the East? When we look at Vladimir Putin in September saying, hey, maybe we need UN peacekeepers, they might be giving little hints that this is more of a headache for them and they want to get out.
Unfortunately, I don't see any clear signs of that, and there was one very important development. When this turmoil started in Luhansk, we learned that quite a substantial portion of Russian troops and Russian tanks immediately crossed into the occupied territory of Ukraine. Across the border, it was next to the city of Krasnodon. So I think it was a very clear manifestation that Russia is in control of this territory, and that Russia will make sure that it will decide, or Moscow will make sure it will decide who is in charge in Luhansk or in Donetsk. Yes, they can sack one war criminal and replace him or her with another one, but it will be in full control of them.
Peter, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think it's more, I think Luhansk was different from the neighboring Donetsk in that there was much more disorder on the ground, there was much more infighting, allegations of looting of humanitarian aid, corruption scandals, and it kind of went against this whole Russian narrative that these statelets are much better than the corrupt Ukrainians, that they are really out there to defend people's rights. So I think this is a little bit of an administrative issue, but I would caution that this could potentially impact the Minsk agreements, because Plotnitsky's signature is on those agreements, and it is important that it stays that way. If all of a sudden Plotnitsky is no longer there and it's not clear yet what his fate will be, this may throw into doubt the entire Minsk process, and it may have to be renegotiated.
Right. Igor, is it going to throw into doubt the entire process?
Well, I do not think that it's going to put under question the process, because the process is the Moscow's plot to keep control of these piece of Ukrainian territory and to force Ukrainian concessions. So Moscow is not going to abandon this process. It's their victory. It's when Ukrainians were forced to sign this so-called deal under the threat of continuation of the very, very bloody attack of the Russian forces. So that's why I do not think that the deal will be abandoned by Moscow, first of all. Secondly, I would say that it's not absolutely correct to say that these forces are under Moscow control, and well, there might be some continuation. The fact that these guys are doing their own business there might lead to some escalation of low-level escalation of these clashes on the line between Ukrainian and terrorist forces. And the third point, which I'd like to make, is that probably it's not correct to say that Putin. It's not correct to ask the question whether Russia is going to withdraw. The goal, which is before the Kremlin now, is to mark the progress of the Minsk process in order to avoid supply delivery of lethal weapons to Ukraine. And the way to achieve that is to show that, well, the process is being, situation is being settled down, the actually ceasefire is in place, we are good, we are discussing peacekeepers, so why javelins at all? We're not going to fight. That is the goal of the process.
Right.
And so everything what is made from Moscow is just to mark this so-called progress. It's not to withdraw.
Petro Poroshenko has been looking west, many Ukrainians looking to the Americans for answers or extra help. There were fears that the Americans were going to throw Ukraine under the bus under Donald Trump. It hasn't quite been the case. Let's have a little listen to what Secretary of State Tillerson had to say recently.
The United States recognizes that the war in Ukraine, in which people are still dying every day, must come to an end. We have repeatedly urged Russia to begin the path to peace by honoring its commitments under the Minsk agreements.
Ambassador Shevchenko, that's about as strong as you're going to get from the United States right now. I know that everybody was afraid beforehand because they didn't know what Trump was going to do, and there was a perception that he was going to be soft towards Moscow. But is Washington giving you all the help that you want?
Well, I would say that we're in very good communications, both with Washington, with Ottawa, with our partners in Europe, with Turkey. But of course, I think we would like to see the world being more involved. And I think the recent developments in Luhansk, they should be actually treated as a very serious call for more action on the behalf of our friends and our partners.
Yeah.
Let's remember about MH17. Let's remember about the enormous amount of weapons in this tribal land. And let's think of possible consequences and of people who keep dying every day. But when it comes to international support, I think we would like to see more action, and I think a possible peacekeeping operation into the east of Ukraine is one of the very important avenues to consider.
Nobody wants to fight Russia, do they, Ambassador Shevchenko? So would you understand why the Europeans and the Americans will say, okay, sanctions and tough words, but we don't want to go to war with Russia over Ukraine?
Well, neither would like to fight Russia. We would not like to fight Russia either, but there is a reality. I think we should really understand that Russia is waging a war not just on Ukraine. It's challenging the free world. It's challenging its neighbors, and we understand that we fight not just for us, but for many of our neighbors. And we strongly appreciate those countries who do understand this and who support this. And Turkey is one of the examples. I think it's very important that Turkey has a very strong message on territorial sovereignty of Ukraine, that President Erdogan helped us to get Crimean Tatar leaders, Chegos and Dumerov, from Russian jails. I think this is that kind of solidarity that we need.
Peter Zalmayev, the OSCE is reporting there has been a spike in violence. The death toll has gone up somewhat recently. We're in this kind of low-intensity state of conflict, but, you know, we shouldn't forget more than 10,000 people have been killed and millions have been displaced. As the solution, some are calling for the US to arm Ukraine with, quote, defensive weapons. There's an understanding that the US National Security Council is planning to send $47 million worth of defensive weapons to Ukraine. Do you accept, Peter, that from the Russian perspective, that will never be seen as defensive weapons? That will be seen as Washington sending attacking weapons to Ukraine and Washington pointing missiles at Moscow?
Absolutely. Whether they think deep down in their hearts, and I mean President Putin, Prime Minister Medvedev, whether it will be offensive or defensive, no doubt the way it will be presented to the public, to the Russians, is that it is an attack on Russia. And I think that this is a very real perspective. America has come very close to deciding to arm Ukraine with lethal weaponry. It will be decided in Congress. There's still no guarantee that it will pass, but there's a good likelihood that it will. Then it will reach the White House, which will be in a position to veto or to keep this in place. And as we see, Donald Trump, no matter how friendly he is to Mr. Putin, he has been hamstrung by allegations of his campaign's relations with the Russians. And as a result of the Robert Mueller's probe that we're seeing now, a lot of his members of his administration have been questioned, have been under suspicion. So I think that Donald Trump will be placed in very difficult circumstances and may have to just go along with this congressional decision should Congress vote for lethal weaponry for Ukraine.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting. Igor, Washington sending arms to Ukraine, is that going to help fast-track peace or spiral us into complete and utter destruction?
Well, Russia, to be honest, cannot afford another spiral of this, another round of this confrontation. It's very difficult. Russia does not have money to finish construction of its most valuable strategic nuclear submarine. So that's why I do not think that it will spiral. First of all. Secondly, well, it's probably worth recalling that just 9 days ago, the final decision to start delivery of the same sort of weapons, javelins, to Georgia was authorized by the State Department. And so delivery will start in a couple of months' time. So I do not think that Russia is going to fight. They try to frighten everybody. They try to frighten everybody against helping the country which is a victim of the Russian aggression. And that is actually the matter of the, stamina of those who leave or do not leave to their own obligations under Budapest Agreement.
Right.
So Russia is not going to start war.
Imran,
come in, Ambassador.
If I can clarify something on the weapons, we should understand what's happening on the ground. We have to fight the Russian aggression with the weapons of the 20th century, while we have in front of us aggressors with the weapons of the 21st century. And I think the world is coming to understand in this situation, because Moscow has been testing very sophisticated weapons in our land. And probably one of the very few ways to prevent further escalation is to make sure that they realize that they can get proper response from the Ukrainian side. And it's very practical. When you're at the front line and when you understand that you can use your weapons without any risk of getting a response from the other side, then there is a huge temptation to do so. We want to avoid that. There are two ways to put more pressure on Moscow. One of them is more sanctions, and the other one is to make sure that Ukraine has weapons to defend itself.
Yeah, Peter, very finally, have Ukrainians had to adjust their expectations as the months have tumbled along? I spoke to President Poroshenko at the beginning of 2016. He said, by the end of the year, we're going to have Crimea back. That deadline came and went. It's been almost 2 years on. Crimea is in the hands of the Russians. It has been annexed, and those Russian-supported separatists are going nowhere in the east. Has Ukraine had to adjust its expectations and maybe accept some facts on the ground?
It's obviously been normalized in the sense that most Ukrainians have come to terms with the fact that this is becoming a protracted, frozen conflict, sort of on the lines of the Transnistria conflict that's been going on for over a couple of decades now. De facto, Ukraine will not and should not acknowledge Russia's sovereignty over either eastern Ukraine or the Crimea, but I think, I'm sorry, de jure, but de facto, I think that's the new reality, and I think Poroshenko has been doing the right thing by putting Ukraine's own house in order, by trying to enact anti-corruption reforms to strengthen the military, and that has proceeded quite successfully and has been noted by Ukraine's Western partners. But you're absolutely right. I think that most Ukrainians now will tell you they're not very optimistic about a speedy resolution to the conflict.
Okay, Peter Zalmayev, Igor Sutyagin, and Ambassador Andrei Shevchenko. It's been a good discussion. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers.